So my last video was really long, so I didn't want to talk anymore, but, well, didn't want to talk anymore in this video. I'm filming this second part, like, immediately following it, so everything's still fresh in my mind. But I figure, you know, more content, spread it out, don't bore people to death with half an hour long monologue. Basically, in the last video, you know, I talked about how the sales of Alien Isolation of 2.1 million is actually bad, and, you know, the publishers, you know, are sort of saying we can't compete in the AAA arena because of the huge costs and the huge risks associated with it. And so they're finding success, you know, bringing their IP to mobile, you know, free-to-play, things like that. Gambling games, apparently, is really big for Konami, and I think Sega Sammy is mostly known for gambling games or machines or things of that ilk, and I think, you know, the Sega portion of the company, you know, isn't... I mean, I think Sammy bought Sega, so I think Sammy might be doing really well, you know, independent of Sega. So, I mean, it makes sense that, you know, they're sort of walking away from the AAA development, and so I think what that means is we're going to see less of these big, expensive games. I think less of them will be made, and this was a shift that happened when the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 came out, is basically... and there was a huge sort of crash around 2008, you know, partially related to the financial collapse, but also because basically up until that point everyone was just hiring, and making the same number of titles they made for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, but the market was too big. Or sorry, the market didn't grow the same way the development teams did. So basically, publishers, you know, had to lay off a bunch of people and reduce the number of projects in development. And so I think we're seeing that again. And it's scary to think, but I think there is going to be a contraction of these big budget, you know, sort of AAA experiences. But I think what we're seeing and what we will be seeing is, you know, indies are sort of the new mid-tier developers. So certainly, you know, if you have a lean development shop and you know, cool ideas, you can create something pretty popular. The scary thing for me as an indie developer is I think that, you know, to really compete, to have, you know, a breakout title, you either have to be very lucky or, you know, really have a super amazing, you know, do everything super amazingly, have a really polished gem, or, you know, really have a large team, or a significant team. So, I mean, I think when looking at indie budgets, you know, it's tough to say because, you know, sometimes people are willing to, you know, live off ramen, cup of ramen, because they're just so excited to be making a game. You know, they're straight out of college. But I think for indie developer to be a sustainable career, you have to look at, you know, older. I'm you know, married. I can't sustain myself on, you know, just making ends meet, cup of ramen and whatnot, and certainly I'm, you know, aware of the fact that I'm more expensive than, you know, the people I'm competing with, and that's one of the reasons why, I mean, I love LA, my wife loves LA, but it's one of the reasons why I want to leave California completely, because, you know, the cost of living makes it more difficult for me to make ends meet, and you know, my dream is to have an office for InfinTap and you know, salaries and things like that. You know, I can't afford, you know, myself living in LA. It's, you know, I don't think, you know, we could succeed as a studio. I mean, especially when you're adding on the costs of having an office, which, I mean, isn't super duper expensive, but it's more expensive. And certainly some people swear that working from home is a better experience, but at least for me, you know, I've been doing indie development and working from home for 7 years, and I think it definitely is better to work in an office, at least for me, and I think for the team as well, the way we want to work. So I mean, like, the standard rate is normally, you assume, $10K a man month is the fully loaded cost of having an employee and having you know, an office, and certainly I imagine that cost is more for a number of companies, like Double Fine. You know, I talked a lot about you know, their challenges of making ends meet, but I would guess, since they're in San Francisco, you know, they have to pay extra so that people can live in the area, because it's very expensive. They're even more so than LA. So I bet their cost per employee, and certainly the rent of their office is going to be more expensive too, is over 10K a man month. So then, you know, when you, I mean, just assuming, you know, 10K a man month, and you say, oh, Broken Age, you know, made 3 million, you know, that's not a ton of man months. You know, that's, it may seem like a lot, but then, you know, if you look at that, they want to have a team of, you know, 15 people working on it, so, you know, basically 3 million divided by 10, K is 300. Oh, 300 man months. I mean, I would kill for 300 man months, but then, you know, divide that by a team of like 15, and then basically you have 20 months. And I imagine they have, you know, again, a higher cost per employee. So I suspect that, you know, that they couldn't do that. You know, they couldn't have the 300 man months and you know, 15 people for 20 months. So I mean, basically, you know, indie development, I think, is getting more expensive and to compete, because basically it used to be there was middle tier developers creating crazy games like Mad Maestro, where you have to like conduct music, or let's see what else weird thing I have. Mr. Mosquito, where you play as a mosquito. And I mean, these were really weird and off the wall and interesting ideas, you know, developed by smallish teams. And now, you know, the smallish teams are making indie games. And so, I mean, it's difficult, because I think the mid-tier is sort of developing this whole new, you know, that basically for a while there's no mid-tier, and I don't think there's a lot of publisher-supported mid-tier, but there's, you know, the indie and the Kickstarter, you know, supported mid-tiers, people getting 3 million for a project and things like that. And you know, people who are just able to invest, you know, or scratch together the money to create, you know, a game like Outlast, and you know, so then that's sort of the mid-tier now that used to be, you know, publisher funded and not indie, but I mean, those are independently developed and funded. But then, you know, then there's sort of the more indie, and certainly there's the one-person indie, and the one-person indie is kind of a good place to be. I mean, I love my team, and I couldn't do it by myself. But, you know, the one-person indie only has one mouth to feed, and you know, one person to worry about. So if you spend, 3 months prototyping something that doesn't work out, it's easier to walk away from that when, we basically have a team of, 4.5 people. So if we spend, 3 months, that's over a man year of work that we would just be throwing out. So fortunately, I feel like we've picked our projects and done, enough pre-planning that we're creating something that we like, that we're not going to walk away from. And also, we're not creating gameplay-focused games, and that's something I'll talk about more, but, our games aren't about gameplay hook. They're about, atmosphere and environment, which presents a completely different set of challenges, but the advantage is that, you don't have to do a bunch of prototypes to see, what sort of mechanics are fun and what's sort of new and innovative. But it's an interesting time because, the other thing I wanted to talk about is the mobile market, and I think the mobile market is moving to be, more publisher, more big developer driven, which is not to say that there can't be indie successes, but I think it's tough to succeed on the mobile market because a lot of it is driven by, the top 100 or whatever, and a lot of that is dominated by these free-to-play games that have huge teams on them. When we were creating National Geographic's Dino Land, which was a disaster, and the publisher it was complicated, but anyway, the game was a disaster. I don't think it's even still available. But basically, they were looking at the top grossers, which I think at that time was like games like Heyday, which was, Supercell before Clash of Clans, and, they're like, oh, well, why don't we have all these features in Heyday? Why don't we have all the features in Jurassic Park Builder? And it's like, well, they spent a significant amount of time on that game and money and that significant might be 500,000, significant might be 1 million. Some of those games, especially if you have a success and then you keep building on it, you just get a ton of features. And because it's a game as a service, because you're continually developing it, it's basically you're making more money than you're putting in, but also you're creating something that is more difficult to compete with, and I think that's something that happened with the free-to-play sort of games, is that it's tough to compete against these games that probably have 5 million of development or more sunk into them because they're grossing 100 million over a year or something. Maybe not that, but some of these games are incredibly profitable. It's tough to compete in the mobile market, and I think, if you have a strong IP, a strong brand like, Konami or like these other publishers that are finding, more success there than AAA, I think it's easier to compete, but it's tough to be an indie there, and so, it was great, when it lasted, where mobile was like the indie, haven, very briefly, but then, it turned into, these new sort of mid-tier developers that are doing these games as a service that are really successful, or publishers with strong IP or, deep pockets to invest in a mobile success. And, I'm sure it's more appealing to them to, gamble $1 million or $2 million on a title than, 50 or 100 million. So anyway, that was my long-winded rant on sort of where the state of the industry is, and I think the summary is that it's a time of transition. It's scary for indie developers, as I think the budgets for indie games and what's competitive increases, and it's scary for AAA publishers and developers as well. So anyway, thanks for watching.